Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Page, and on behalf of the Siskey Group's Beyond Good Ideas Foundation and Thanera Bailey, their president and CEO, we'd like to welcome you today to our webinar. I'm currently a Siskey intern and a USC graduate student studying my master's in social work. And I'd like to welcome today, and I'm very honored to have with us two professors from USC, Dr. Carol Ann Peterson and Professor Stephanie George, who will be joining us today and discussing the very important social conditions of domestic violence and homelessness and where that interaction comes into play and the intersectionality of them. Stephanie George is currently a professor at USC, and she is the Northwest Regional Director of Field Education on the Virtual Academic Center. Prior to that, Ms. George was employed at the Department of Veteran Affairs for over 9 years, where she serves as the clinical project coordinator for the National Center on Homelessness among veterans. And she is currently pursuing a doctorate of education in organizational change and leadership. And we'd like to welcome her today to our panel. We also have with us today Dr. Carol Ann Peterson. She is also a professor at USC, and we're very proud to have them both here today. She teaches courses on domestic violence, leadership, and policy advocacy. Recently, she was appointed to the Los Angeles Mayor's Domestic Violence Steering Committee, which oversees the research and design of needs and assessment for funding for the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation in California. And she was the founder and CEO and chair of the board of directors of the Peterson Professional Alliance. So I'm very happy to have them both here today, and I'd like to welcome you all. We would like you to join in the conversation. Please feel free to use the chat box on the right if you have any questions, and we'll save about 10 minutes at the end to address those questions. So thank you again for being with us today. I just wanted to give you just a little background for us that 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence. And we have an astounding number of people in our country that are homeless, that do not have a place to live every day. So we're going to be talking today about the plight of the victims of domestic violence and how homelessness interacts with that for them in their life. So we're going to make you more aware about their dilemmas in finding affordable housing, the dilemma of having to return home because they do not have anywhere to live for them and their children, and talking a little bit about best practices for preventing homelessness among victims of domestic violence and what these are, and hopefully motivating you to get involved and become an advocate for homelessness and for the victims of domestic violence. So we're going to start out today with our first question. We're going to talk about how can homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters work together to prevent victims from returning to the abuser. I'll let either one of you take the lead on that one.
You can start.
All right. I think one of the things, most domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters are aware of each other, but one of the issues that comes up a great deal is really connecting them, in the sense that for domestic violence shelters, they really need to know that the person they're taking in has a history and a background of domestic violence and not simply homelessness or mental health issues. But I think for homeless shelters, part of the issue becomes not always asking those questions to know whether or not they have a domestic violence victim coming in for the night. And so I think some of it is educating each other on services, the questions that are asked, how they're asked, so that we can make better referrals, and also knowing when to make those phone calls. For Los Angeles County, our shelters are 97% full at any given time, so knowing who's the clearinghouse that you need to call to find out if there's a bed, and making that transition as seamless and as smooth as possible for the victim and their children. Professor George?
Absolutely. No, I agree with you completely that it definitely begins with assessment and doing a thorough assessment of what the needs are. And I think a big piece that we see across the country has to do with when families, when mothers in particular and children go into shelters. So often when shelters are full, people that are multiple family members together are often turned away. So there needs to be a way to, just like you said, a clearinghouse of knowing who can accept women and children or men and children, whoever the individuals are that are needing those resources that have experienced domestic violence. Because so often, I know through my history in trying to find shelters for families with or without domestic violence in their history, it's very difficult to find shelter for a family with children, especially when boys are over age 12 sometimes. So really making sure we have those resources in place to protect the family and children can really be something that we can do, I think, better on. We've gotten better, but we can do even more work.
Well, and two, just to sort of jump in, you brought up one of the issues that has always been a huge stumbling block over the past 10 years, and that is men. You know, where do we put men who are victims? Where do we put folks who are LGBT when those resources are very limited? You know, hopefully the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act 2013, adding the LGBT community for specific services and funding will help alleviate some of that. But as we know, it's always kind of a long process. So we probably won't see quite the results that we would like for probably at least another 5 years.
Thank you to both of you. That was really insightful information. And Dr. Peterson, yes, thank you for bringing that up about men and the LGBTQ community, because that is, the research is so limited on that, because when you go back, the research for domestic violence is really only about 40 years old. I mean, we're talking about in the 1970s, even in the early 80s, the police were still told to consider it a private matter. So we didn't have a lot of interaction of helping women with restraining orders, of helping them to leave the home. And so now we're finding out, the research is showing 1 in 14 men are victims of domestic violence. And now we're waiting for research to come out as to LGBTQ, because we have the intimate partner violence. So now we're going with that, you know, domestic violence was in the last 40 years. Now we're kind of talking intimate partner violence, because it could be man to man, woman to woman, and so that's where research really has to come into play for that. You were talking about the shortage of domestic violence services, and the National Census of Domestic Violence has indicated that we are short on programs, that we have in a 24-hour period approximately 48,000 people that are now using the services, but there are still about 10% that do not receive services on a given night. So we're trying to, what in your opinion are the most important services that women, men, anyone that's involved in domestic violence, what are those key services in the first 24 to 48 hours that you feel are the most important that they need to receive?
Dr. Peterson, you can start.
Catherine, you were breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure what the last part was, but some of it is, you know, to backtrack a little bit, was the last survey, which has been about 12 years ago, out of Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, indicated that over 60% of women and children on the street were there because of domestic violence. So some of that is, we need to do a better job of identifying those who are on the street and figuring out where can we place them. Part of what also takes place is that for homeless shelters, you know, generally it's one night, it's a first come first served basis, and it makes it really kind of difficult for victims to figure out what to do in that crisis moment. And so we have to figure out a better way of connecting our victims from homelessness and domestic violence programs in those first 24 to 48 hours when the crisis is at the highest and the most dangerous for the victims.
Absolutely. And to add on to that, the way shelter systems work, often people have to check in by 4 o'clock or 4:30. And when you're in a relationship with domestic violence, there may be a need for medical care. And if someone is at the emergency room or at the doctor's office or talking with a counselor, they have to be cognizant of that cutoff time, right? To stand in line, to go to a shelter. And that may impede two things. One, from them getting the correct medical care they need or counseling services they need, or the shelter bed. And so to have to pick between those while you're in a crisis moment really can be unfair to the individual. So again, to find out how to build this connection and this networking to maybe reserve a bed for someone, or to, work with the community partners to make sure that we don't put it all on the individual who's going through that crisis moment, that we really can be an extension for that individual or family that's in need.
And Professor George, you brought up a side point that triggered for me the issue of, if once they're through the emergency, if their first contact becomes that homeless shelter, maybe what the homeless shelter could do is take them in for a couple of hours, connect them immediately to a domestic violence program, and then can we make that connection to immediately do that intake? A lot of domestic violence shelters may not be able to take them in after midnight, but if the homeless shelter could just house them at that reserved bed for that one night, now that they've done the intake with the domestic violence shelter, get them over there the next morning. And that way we make a more seamless process and easier for the victims to feel that somebody cares, somebody's listening, and that they're not having to wait 48 hours to figure out where they're going to go.
Excellent points, both of you. And I know in my research, when I was listening to testimonials from survivors, that was one of their biggest concerns, was that first 48 hours, because most of them are afraid that their partners or husbands are coming to look for them. They've already been threatened that they're going to be charged with kidnapping. In many cases, the husbands use that as a threat, that you're taking the children. I'm going to sue you for custody. I have a lawyer. In many cases, that the testimonies that I've heard and listened to, and even met some of the victims at some of the shelters and gotten to talk to them, is that they feel they don't have access to the money, that their partner or husband has access to all the money. So how am I going to pay for a lawyer? That's one of the main things on their mind, is the safety of their children and what's going to happen to my children. So do you feel that currently the shelters are providing enough legal help for the victims to cross that barrier? Because the first barrier to them is filing for separation, filing for custody. These are all daunting legal issues for them when like you said, they're already in a crisis.
Well, most domestic violence programs do have a connection to a legal service program. I think part of the disconnect is sometimes victims don't know that. So when they're seeking services, they don't know the services that are provided. The other piece, however, may be if I'm running a shelter in a very rural community, the legal service may be, a couple of 100 miles away. The example I use a lot is Alaska. If I'm in a very remote area, the nearest major city with a shelter and legal services could be 400 miles away. We have to start thinking outside the box of what do we provide and how do we provide it. And in rural areas like Alaska, you may not even have a homeless shelter. So now we've got to really figure out, where do we go? What do we do? One of my favorite articles I recommend to my students is called, "Where Do You Go When It's 40 Below?" And those are the times we really need to step up and figure out what to do and how to do it better.
I agree. And covering Alaska in our territory for USC, for the BAC, we see that. We try to place USC interns in Alaska, and we'll say 100-mile radius, there's not even a social service agency, let alone a homeless shelter, domestic violence shelter. And so really to find out how to communicate to those individuals who are isolated, in their own home and then isolated in their community is really difficult. And I think even looking at our urban areas, like in San Francisco, we tell a student or we tell someone, oh, just go 10 miles. Well, that could take several hours depending on how the traffic patterns are. So, we really have to think logistically about those things. While we say, oh, just do this or just go here, what does that really take for someone to do those things and to get there? And that's why it's so important that we have the right people in the jobs, such as social workers, to make sure that we're thinking of all of those things. So we're not having to put it on the client or someone who's not prepared educationally to really do the best for their client and community.
Thank you. That was really insightful, and especially when you talk about rural. A lot of times when we think about homelessness, we focus in on big cities, we focus in on urban, and we tend to forget about looking, through a different lens. That yes, we have homelessness everywhere, we have domestic violence everywhere, and how do we bridge the gap for those that are in the rural areas? And when you spoke about getting there, that was crucial, because I have heard in some of the testimonials from the victims, I don't have a car. How am I supposed to get, myself and my children to the closest homeless shelter? Could be 20 miles away. It could be 10 or 30. And then you talk about, can they get on a bus? Can they get on a train? I have no money. My partner or my husband doles out an allowance to me. So there's so many issues. So many times you hear this in the media, and you hear it from people. Why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't he just leave? It's so much more complicated than what people could ever imagine. It's not just that simple as people think, to pack your bag and walk out. And why domestic violence shelters are so necessary, according to the research, and I know that you both agree, is because there is where a victim can complete a safety plan. Not many victims have a safety plan in place. They don't even know what one is, and they can be educated as to a safety plan. They are given their rights as a victim. A lot of them don't feel they have any rights, because they've been told for years that they're nothing, that they're nobody. So to actually find out I have rights is empowering for these victims. So given all of that, what do you think is right now are the best practices that we're using for transitional housing, emergency shelter for the victims of domestic violence? Do you have any in mind? I know I've researched a couple that you've worked with or that you know of that are really showing good results for women to have transitional housing until they can get through the legal process and get a job and get on their feet.
Well, I think part of it is we need to start changing our terminology. And not only our terminology, even back to the beginning, I think we need to eliminate the term violence and use abuse, because we do a disservice for those victims who may be only psychologically abused, economically abused, mentally and emotionally, and they're waiting for the black eye. That may never come. So even that shift we need to do. The other shift is a lot of our domestic violence shelters are changing the focus. It's always been one size fits all. We can't do that anymore. Our population is much more culturally diverse. And so some of the programs are not doing emergency or transitional, they're doing client-centered. And initially they'll say, well, why don't we put you here for 30 days, but you let us know what's working. If you're okay after 2 weeks, that's fine. If you need more time. And they're doing the extension from 30 days up to 2 years seamlessly, simply for the fact that they're focusing on what does the client want? What does the client think they need to make that transition? But the other piece is we ask clients to jump through so many hoops that it becomes nearly impossible. And so one of my favorite programs is the Family Justice Centers, where victims go as a one-stop to do every service except shelter. Restraining orders, if they need to go through Child Protective Services, the DA's office, whatever it may be, it's there, and they're not traveling for large cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, New York, Chicago, major distances to get to all the services. And so I think those are the ways we need to start focusing, and then figure out what do we need to do past that to make this easier for victims, including looking at the courts. One of my favorite people, who is one of my guest lecturers, Judge Mark Uhas, out of the family court, knows that my feeling is judges are one of our weak links. And we need to get judges better educated. In fact, Georgia recently, in one of their small towns, Columbus, Georgia, has now instituted a new law, which is breaking my heart, that if victims call 911 and then don't testify, they're being charged for that 911 call at a minimum of $50 up to over $200. And added to that, if they can't pay the fee, they're being jailed. So all we've done is re-victimize the victim several times over in that process. So we need to figure out how to do this better and educate judges and other entities that come in contact outside of our purview.
I've never heard that before. That's horrible. And to add on to that, one thing I wanted to mention, so the work I did with the VA, it was interesting because about four or 5 years ago now, I was talking, we were looking at data on homeless veterans in general. And someone asked the question, how many veterans are in domestic violence shelters? And so we started poking around. And when we looked around nationally, we have no idea because the question's not asked, which goes back to kind of our earlier point about the assessment has to have so many more pieces in it. But then vice versa, we said to ourselves, okay, we're looking at domestic violence shelters. They don't ask, did you serve in the military? Because of course there's a correct way to ask that question, especially for women as well. If you say, did you serve in the military? Women may say no. Or if you say, are you a veteran? They may say no. If you instead phrase it as, did you serve in the military? They're more likely to say yes, if that is the case. But on the flip side, we noticed in the homeless program, we weren't asking the question either. On our assessments, we weren't asking our veterans, have you experienced intimate partner violence? Or have you experienced, domestic abuse or violence, whatever the question was at the time we were discussing this. And we thought, well, why are we putting it all on the domestic violence shelters? Where's our piece in this that we can really make this connection? So hopefully that's changing. And it has changed in the past 4 or 5 years. And the VA also started an intimate partner violence task force. And there's now a national intimate partner violence director at the VA, which is new within the past 5 years. And they show, I'm totally off topic of your question, but it just made me think of this when you were talking, that about anywhere from 30 to 70% of women and men who have served in the military report that they've had intimate partner violence sometime in their life. Where even more shocking, about 3 to 10% of current active duty individuals are saying that they've experienced intimate partner violence while active duty. So that lends the piece as well, going back to what Dr. Peterson said too, it's emotional, physical, now it's job related. If they're to report there's intimate partner violence in their workplace, or because their spouse or their partner, whoever, could also be in the military as well, it makes it so much more sensitive and so much more likely for people not to speak up, because then it implicates their job, their security, and possibly what can bring them to have that independence. So it's so complicated the more systems we get into. So we really do, as Dr. Peterson said, have to make it easier, for the client that we're working with, because there's so much mounted behind them already.
Well, and as Professor George was talking, one of the things that we also miss sometimes are those extra connections, such as for veterans and active military who have been in combat. There's the issue of traumatic brain injury. We are just now having the light bulb go on that there's traumatic brain injury in our victims as well. And so if I've got somebody who's a victim of domestic violence married to somebody who's a veteran or in military, that traumatic brain injury may get very complicated within this family system. And then you add to that the possibility, if I leave, I not only have a medical condition, but now I'm living on the street. This becomes so multi-layered. And it's one of the reasons why we find a lot of people don't do this work. It's not sexy, it's ugly, it's complicated, it's multi-layered. It's, one of those where people throw up their hands and say, how do you do this work? And then added to the other piece is that we're now looking at victims and the impact of strangulation. San Diego, through the Family Justice Center, now has the Strangulation Training Institute, and we are finding that any signs of strangulation is a precursor to homicide. So now I've made this even more dangerous for victims to consider, if I leave, am I homeless, or do I stay and I'm dead? And so we're asking them to make multiple layered decisions that are complicated. And if it's hard enough for us who work in the field, imagine what it's like for our victims that we work with, whether they're, veterans in active duty military, law enforcement even. And so we're just now scratching the surface, even after 40 years of all the work we still have to do.
Thank you both. I appreciate how candid you are about it, because yes, I think of many social workers, regardless of what field they choose to go into, in social work, there's so many, do feel that way. Like you were saying, just throw your hands up and say, what do I do next? And you have to bring yourself back to the piece, one victim at a time, one homeless person at a time, one at a time, because it's overwhelming if you look at it any other way. And I commend you both for the years of service that you've given to the profession of social work. I'm new at this. I'm still a student, and I'm overwhelmed at how much you give of your time and your talents, and your own personal life is involved in your causes. And the one-stop shop that you mentioned really touched with me, because in my research I've been noticing that there's more of that, because like you were saying, how does a victim who has to deal with 7 different issues go to 7 different places while they're depressed, possibly, like you said, possibly having medical conditions, even possibly concussions or brain trauma from the amount of abuse they've taken? Or like you said, it's not always violence. It can be emotional abuse, which affects you on so many different levels. How do you possibly cope? So given that it looks like the one-stop shop, to me, after all the research I've done, and I'm sure after everything that you guys have been involved with, it does look to be a key element in how we could move forward, because we do feel, I think, as social workers, that we're kind of stuck right now. Like, how do we move forward? How do we find housing for them? How do we stop? I mean, I don't know the exact stat on this, Professor. Dr. Peterson, you may know, but how many times women go back to the house and then are actually killed by their husband, and how many try to leave multiple times until they finally do leave? And I think maybe having this one-stop shopping for them where they can get all these resources would be maybe a way to help them to leave sooner. What do you think we could do as advocates, and what could people that want to get involved in this social condition, what could we do to help? Talking about the judges, talking about laws, funding, what could we do to make this move forward from where we are now?
All of the above. But one of the pieces is that you were, sort of applauding us for our efforts and everything else, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure Professor George does too. But it's also a question of the fact that none of us feel that we're experts, because there's always so much that's changing, such as traumatic brain injury, such as the strangulation. So there's always something that's a new piece and a new layer for all of us. A lot of it is sharing our information, continuously doing webinars and trainings and workshops. And so I'm constantly, in between sitting on webinars and listening and getting more information and looking at what former students and friends and colleagues post on Facebook. That's how I found out about the Georgia issue. And really sort of staying attuned. But part of it is not just funding, it's thinking outside the box. Sometimes we get so stuck in our world, we forget to look outside of where we are. The Family Justice Centers started in San Diego a little over about 12 years ago, is the brainchild of both Casey Gwen, who was then city attorney in San Diego, and Gail Strack. And it literally took them 5 years to put that strategy together. And it really was a needs assessment, looking at all the agencies victims could touch and bringing them together to sit at a table and say, how do we make this work? It then became literally a program applauded by then President George Bush to do this nationwide. And I'm not sure, I believe there is well over 80 family justice centers throughout the United States. But it's always a question of funding. It's always a question of, where do we go next? How do we take that next step, and what is that? The funding issue always angers me, in the sense that in the last reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, we did not get all of our funding for the first couple of years. We only got something like 75%, and we had to wait. That waiting means that our shelter programs, our family justice centers, education even for judges, then gets stalled because they don't have the full funding to go forward. And so we have to do this piecemeal. It slows down our progress to look at the next steps, because we always know that next step that might come along is going to require funding. But we also don't want to compete with homeless shelters for funding. We don't want to compete with other entities and have other programs feel that they're reducing their funding because we quote unquote took their money. But at the same time, we need to not feel that we're competing, but start to do more collaboration in grant writing and in our proposals and sharing that funding much more across the board.
Yeah, so I was going to say the word, I'm thinking, listening, like collaboration, and that's what we need to do. And I really think universities, right? So we have grand challenges for social work, we have wicked problems, we have all of these things, and it's time that we need to come together with domestic violence, with homelessness, with traumatic brain injury, so many things and how they tie in together, and get the School of Education, School of Social Work, School of Nursing, School of Public Health, Public Policy, all to get together. And even at the university level for students, have interdisciplinary classes where they learn how to collaborate together so they can then come out ready to run, as they get employed together in these agencies. And also we can leverage, think about USC, nationally, we have students in every single state. So therefore, kind of going back to Facebook and how you heard about Georgia and those things, there's no reason why we should only look at our community, because if we look grander, we can learn best practices from other areas, and we can also spread the message louder because there's that many more people to echo it. And so I really feel with homelessness and with domestic violence, with any really social problem, we really need to leverage colleges and universities to have them supply the research, do the education, have the webinars, because the people that are in the agencies doing the work day to day, that hard work, don't have time to sit down and read articles, during the day and say, oh, this happened in New Hampshire and I should practice this. We need to bring that information to them and be partners with them, regardless of funding and regardless of, what their proximity is to us, but out of the nature of helping people, because that's why we're here. And that's the reason why social work started, was really to do that grassroots foundation work. And universities really can leverage each other to continue that work. And again, the national, and with your group and nationally, and having webinars and having that virtual component, the fact that we can do things virtually right now and all of us are sitting in different states is phenomenal. And we can do that more and more. And the more comfortable people get with that technology, we could bring it in not only to each other through universities and agencies, but for our clients as well. There's no reason why possibly, an attorney couldn't sit with someone on Skype or on a classroom or something like that to be able to facilitate these things when they live in Alaska and can't get somewhere. So we just think outside of the box and really leverage who's already doing the work educationally and then physically in the community.
And Professor George, when you were talking about collaboration, I realized one of the pieces we keep missing, we need to make sure that we are training our doctors. I hear so often from residents, well, if I got 2 hours on domestic violence, I got a lot. And I'm thinking, you are frontline responders. You're going to see them in the emergency room. You're going to see them in your office. And if you're not trained in how to ask the question and find the resources, whether it's even a homeless shelter or a domestic violence shelter, then we're missing a whole gap in there that somebody isn't stepping up to the plate, and we need to hold them accountable as well.
Yes, and to tag on that, we might not leave this question, to tag on that. So what that VA started doing is called a clinical reminder, and it's for homelessness, but it can work for anything. And they do ask about domestic abuse, but maybe not enough. So what they started with the clinical reminder with homelessness, every single veteran that walks into a VA across the country gets asked the question about housing. Is your housing stable? Are you at risk for homelessness? Are you at risk financially in your home, renting, arrears, all these different things on housing? It's not just asked to those they think might have a problem, which of course was a problem with homelessness for a long time, that stereotypical, well, you don't look homeless, so I'm not going to go there. So now nurses ask that question to everybody. It does not matter who you are. If you were a colonel or you were, a front linesman for 60 days, it doesn't matter. And so it's become this comfortable question now where people ask it because it's necessary. And it tiered from the housing crisis, in 2006, 2008, 2009, where people were getting foreclosed on left and right, regardless of who they were. And so with that, with domestic abuse, are we asking enough men? Are we really only focusing on women? I don't know, the answer, but I can assume that's probably happening. And so it's really important. And with going back to the doctor, so often when I worked in hospitals, throughout my career, they would say, okay, of course they do all the medical things, absolutely appropriate. Well, now if you have a problem, now see the social worker. So it's always already that kind of negative. If something's going on and challenging and wrong, now you can talk to the social worker. Well, nobody wants to be perceived as something's wrong. And so of course they might say to the doctor, no, nothing's wrong, I'm fine. And that's not the case. And so it's really important that the message comes from everybody, not just the social worker, because people that have experienced social workers in their life who were in foster care or who maybe we're homeless and we're having a tough time, seeing a social worker or being told about the social worker is not necessarily a happy thing. People don't want to be told they're going to see the social worker sometimes, and we need to change that too. But definitely working with challenging, clients and the life situations they're in, it needs to not just be about see the social worker or see the social service person. It needs to be about talk to your community, and that's so many people, not just us.
Yeah, in fact, when you were talking about you don't look homeless, I try and teach my students that, don't make judgments about your client when they sit down, because you don't have any clue. And I learned that lesson early on when I was just working out of high school. And I worked for an architect in Beverly Hills. And there was this woman who would come by every day with a shopping cart, but she was dressed in a Chanel suit. And so finally, one day I asked one of the folks in the firm who had been there a very long time, homeless. And my first initial thought was, first of all, if I'm going to be homeless, can I be homeless in Beverly Hills? And secondly, I would never have thought she was homeless because of how she was dressed. And so it was a very quick lesson for me to realize, don't judge somebody you don't know. And so it's really one of those pieces I instill in my students is, you have no idea who your client is sitting in front of you, and they may not look like they need domestic violence. They may not look homeless, but you need to ask the questions and validate for them who they are and what is it that they need. And, the reminder to my students is, I'm sure you do, Professor George, and that is, you've got to meet your clients where they are. It's not our job to tell them where they need to go and what they need to do. We've got to follow their lead and provide that for them.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things I tell my students and would tell my interns when I had them at the VA was, you have to be okay with having a client fail. Just a little bit, not too big of a fail, but to fail. Because they may come to us and say, no, I'm not going to talk to you. Everything's fine. I'm great. Mm-hmm. And what we have to do is let them come back and not judge them when they come back and say, see, I told you you needed services. Right? We say, okay, are you ready now? If you're ready now, I'm ready now. And it has to be exactly, what you said is that it has to be their time to come to us. Even though we know they may need this thing, we can't do it unless they're ready to have it. There's a video I show in one of my classes called It's Not About the Nail. It's a YouTube video where the girl has a nail literally stuck in her head. And she's talking about this pain and it's aching. And the person she's with is kind of saying, well, take the nail out of your head. And she's like, it's not about the nail. And all she wanted, the video ends up him saying, oh, that must be difficult. That must be hard for you. And she was like, yes. And that's what she wanted. She just wanted that acknowledgement. But it's so obvious. There's this nail. And so I always bring it back to that of, even though it's obvious to us, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. And especially domestic, abuse. And I'm going to use that term from now on and not say violence. It's so important that it's not obvious. And homelessness, sometimes, like you're saying, with a snail shoe, it's not obvious. It's only when it's obvious that they maybe get assistance. And so what about preventative work? How can we be preventative in this? And that goes back to, education, working with the schools of education. How do we really instill in children to recognize it's not okay to have these things happen in your home? And what can they do as children to advocate for themselves? So there's so many ways to collaborate and to build that education that we could be here forever. So I'll let you go ahead and go ahead, Catherine.
Well, before Catherine does that, though, because one of the things that came out of welfare reform came out of the state of Michigan, and that is they mandated that every client going through the welfare system was part of a multidisciplinary team. Everybody was at the table. Child Protective Services, domestic violence advocates, homeless services, their case manager from the welfare department, and the family. And so what would happen is they would talk with the family about what they thought the family needed and say, from all of us at the table, we can offer you A, B, C, and D. And sometimes the family would say, I only want C, and that was supposed to be okay with the multidisciplinary team. If that's all you wanted, that was fine. We'll help provide that for you. But if you want to come back and do A, B, and D, we'll offer that as well. Just know we're here. And they would ask families to come back about every 30 days just to check in. But I think the missing piece many times is that we leave out the client in those decision-making process. And so it literally needs to wind up being those collaborations and those multidisciplinary teams, including the families, the clients, and our victims.
Thank you both. That was a phenomenal exchange of information between the two of you, and how you played off of each other's experiences. It was great, and you gave us a lot of things to think about. I'm gonna have to go watch it back so I can take notes. Something though, the key word for me, the takeaway is collaboration. How important it is, and I think we've seen that in a lot of the failures that have gone on with advocacy and with policy in the last 20 years, the key piece I've noticed in the research is that there is a failure of collaboration. And how do we get everyone to work together? And I think you were talking about the family justice centers and having these one-stop shops. Again, I think that all, really does tie it all nicely together. Some of the programs that I researched, I don't know if you've heard of them or not, but New Destiny Housing in New York City has made great strides in trying to bring everything into one building, all the services that the victims need. The Housing First in Washington, the state of Washington, has also been trying to do that. So my question to you is, given that there's these programs out there, I know you spoke of San Diego, and I'm talking about New York, and we're talking about Washington. Here close to where I'm living in the LA area is the Door of Hope, and I was lucky enough to go visit and have a tour, and they're doing the same thing there. They're trying to offer legal services, childcare, up to 6 months to a year of housing for children and their families, and they even have separate residents for single fathers who are trying to raise their children as well, which I think is a great, a lot of people don't think about that. What about the single dads with the kids? So they're really trying to get all the pieces together. How can we try to, like you said, maybe using the family justice centers that are throughout the country and these programs, and how can we try to have more of a streamline of a program opposed to all of these individual programs trying to make it on their own? Is there a way to streamline this for victims of domestic violence who are faced with homelessness, even in the homelessness situation with the veterans that are homeless, like Professor George talked about? And there's so many different intersectionalities that fall into this area. I would love to think going forward we could think outside of the box, like you say, Dr. Peterson, and how can we make this happen in every city in America? Every city in America has a one-stop shop so that nobody has to drive 20 or 30 miles or feel like they have no way to turn. And is working with the universities, is that where we start? Where can we begin, I guess, is the question. We have to begin somewhere.
Well, I think part of it, though, is that we have to remember one size doesn't fit all. I mean, Utah's also doing Housing First. But I think for major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, when we're so spread out that you have to have enough programs conveniently located, and right now we don't have that. The Family Justice Centers in Los Angeles, the last I knew, there's 3, I believe. And so that's not enough for the size of Los Angeles. The Housing First also may not work in Los Angeles because of space constraints. And so Housing First has been, looking at the tiny homes concept and things of that nature. But I think for Los Angeles and other major cities, it's looking at abandoned buildings. Is there a way, if they've been abandoned long enough by the owners, that the owners have lost sort of ownership, to be able to take them over and somehow rehab them? But you also have to remember, homeless folks are their own community. Not all of them are going to want to leave those friends that they've made and that extended family to be somewhere else. And that may indeed, with Housing First, uproot some of those folks to different locations. And so we need to be prepared that not all of them want to go. And then how do we provide services, which is the key piece, for those who aren't going, who aren't leaving the street, they still need to have those services. So we have to look at multiple prongs of attack, if you will, for lack of a better term, of how to provide what folks need when they're not going to leave that community. And for them, that is a family, and they're not all going to want to leave the family and make that change.
And I think too, we really need to have people understand how money works in terms of where it comes from and how the funders get the money to the grantee, and especially if it's the United States government. Having worked for the VA, the things I learned, good and bad, about funding sources and allocation and what that means. Because so often someone will say, well, why don't you just do this? The VA has this money, just do this. But you can't. There's so many, what's the word I want to use? There's so many terms, I guess I could say, of how the money can be allocated here or there. And the VA has something similar. They have CRRCs, which are Community Resource Referral Centers, which are a one-stop shop for homeless veterans. And they do have people from domestic violence shelters come into those as well to do assessments as needed. Not as much probably as they should, but a few do. And we're only able to have them in so many areas because there's only so much funding. And so if there's one in Utah, there might not be one in Colorado. There is one, but so it's kind of that, okay, where can we best position them, but not overdo it because of the funding that we have? And then what happens when the funding runs out? What happens when this is no longer the topic of the moment? And then it starts to go somewhere else, and kind of, going back to the point of, we don't want to take money from someone else to say, we need it more, you need it more, because we all need it. So again, it always goes in my mind back to that word collaboration. How can we leverage each other? But I think that I'm a huge advocate of having people learn how to write grants well, and how to understand how to then use the money once they get the grant. Because reviewing grants for a number of years, we'd be like, oh, their concept is so good, they just wrote it wrong. They wrote it in the wrong place, because you get certain points for different areas, and only if they shifted this to this other paragraph, it would have been right. And so really, to understand, it's not about just applying for the funding. It's really understanding how the process works. And I know that I didn't learn a lot about that until I was in it, right? They're like, here's your new job, write a grant. And I was like, oh my gosh, 10 years ago when I took a grant writing class, is not coming to me. And so how can we have that continuing education to do more grant writing where it doesn't cost tons of money to learn, to go to workshops to learn how to write a grant? Because typically we're writing grants because we don't have the money. And so it needs to be just, again, more collaboration of really having people understand, from the moment the client walks in the door to the minute the government or state or whoever is giving the funding. We have to learn it from both angles.
Yeah, as Professor George says, I sort of learned how to write grants in the same fashion. It was, can you write a grant? And I'm going, sure, no problem. And I'm thinking, I have no clue as to what I'm doing, but we'll figure it out. And I know it's why my students get so frustrated with me when they write their papers, because they get really nitpicky about all the details. And I tell them, if this were a grant proposal, I just rejected you. And that's a piece that hasn't quite made a connection for them yet. But so often when I have reviewed grants on the national level for the Violence Against Women Act, same thing. I get a grant proposal that was not supposed to be bound, and it's bound. I have to reject it. I get a grant proposal that came, with 15 typos on every single page. Presentation now went down in terms of the points there. And so all of it adds up, and they don't always get that. I get to the bottom line, and if you came in below that threshold, it's like any paper, you come in below the threshold, I have to reject you. You just cost your agency $1 million. And so, but it is also true that more grants anymore are literally coming from the basis of who are you collaborating with? And you have to have collaboration partners. The other piece that all of us don't like to always think about when you're looking at funding, outcome measures, you have to quantify what you're doing anymore. It's not the days of 25, 30 years ago when we wrote a grant, we got money, we could figure out what to do and spend the money. And now it's outcome measures. Who are you serving? How many are you serving? What kind of services are provided under this? And so all of that comes into play. And as Professor George said, everybody needs to know how to write a grant. You need to know the buzzwords. You need to follow the directions absolutely to the letter, and do that collaboration. And if we're not doing that collaboration, we're all going to be sitting here competing for the same funds, and it's just not going to happen.
Thank you both, and thank you for bringing up the piece about grant writing and looking for funding, because a lot of us that are do-gooders and we want to go out and save the world and we have all these great ideas, we don't think about that component. I've been fortunate enough to have this wonderful internship with the Nara Bailey and the Siskey group, and it's a big piece of our internship. We spend an entire semester on development, looking for funders, and grant writing. And of course, going into that piece, I was like, oh no, I don't want to do this part. But I'm so grateful that I was given that opportunity to do it and be forced to do it, basically. But I have learned more about how to search for funders and the importance of grant writing and what it means to an agency. And so for those of you out there that are social workers or budding social workers, and you're not really sure what your calling is, and maybe your calling is the kind of person that wants to sit and do research and try to find funders for your cause, as opposed to being the one on the front lines, maybe out in the communities with the signs and advocating. We need more of you, because that it is a very technical area, and without the funding, without the grants, we lose a lot of programs, like you said. So thank you both for bringing that up. It's such a crucial component in all the good work that we're trying to do. We have about 10 minutes left. It's hard to believe. We could talk for hours, I know. I'm just wondering if we have any questions from the audience. Does anybody have anything they want to ask Dr. Peterson or Professor George today? I'll defer to my behind the scenes tech supervisor and president of the Siskey group, Nara. If there's any questions out there, she's going to post them for us.
And Catherine, I don't know if we were supposed to be able to see the chat box. I don't see it. So if the questions come up, could you just read them for us, please?
Yes, yeah, I believe Nara is actually going to post if anyone has any questions right now. There will also be questions, I'm sure, to follow, because we're going to allow those that watch it back on the video to actually ask you questions. So I'll be retrieving those questions, and then I'll be sending them on to you for answers, and then replying back to those that joined us after the fact. So we're waiting to see if there's any questions right now from the audience. Is there anything that you guys want to add?
One thing I wanted to add was kind of going back to measures. I think it's really important that we really ethically and just our values of being social workers or being people, we really need to make sure we keep integrity in our programs as well, because so often when we really have to look at measures, we'll just change the definition. So we're meeting the measure and we start to lose focus of what we actually were doing in the first place, which is so upsetting. Because on one hand, it looks great, right? Our funders or whoever we're reporting to say, oh, look, you're supposed to be at 90%, you're at 91%. That's amazing. But then if you dig through that 91%, might not really be what the measure was looking for. Or it might be you stretched the client to meet that, that check box or whatever it is. So I think it's so important. When we do an assessment with our students in one of our classes, we go through kind of, why are you doing the assessment? If you don't know why you're asking this question, don't ask it. Go back and ask yourself, why would this question be on the assessment? What value does it have? And what am I trying to get at? And because if we just ask an assessment and check the box because it says to, we're missing the whole point. And I think, too, if we actually look at our assessments and understand why we're asking the question, why our funder has a measure at 90% of whatever, why 90%? Why this question? Why is this so important at this part in our grant or in our funding? And we really have to ask that why question. I have a 5-year-old who constantly is asking why still, and a 3-year-old who's just learning the why question. And so, it's kind of like, because I said so. And that's what we do sometimes, I think as agencies and as funders, because we said so, that's why. And so we have to remind ourselves, keep asking the question until we understand it. And it's so important to, when I worked at one agency, I won't say where because it's not a good story. When I worked at one agency, we had to do something a certain way. And I asked my supervisor, well, why do we do it this way? And she said, because the policy says so. So I was like, okay, watch this. Why does the policy say so? Like, who wrote the policy? Where did that come from? And she was like, oh, you're not my favorite. But I had to know, because the only reason why I know to do something is if I know where it came from. And so we get so lost in that. And I think whether it's, domestic abuse or homelessness or working with foster children or, doing anything, we have to know the why. I think Simon Sinek, right? Start with the why as one of his really popular books right now, but it's so true. And if we remind ourselves of that, and even if we have interns in our agencies and they're working on a grant or something like that, show them the actual grant, show them what the application looked like, and what are they looking for? What are we saying we're going to do? So we always check ourselves back to our purpose and kind of our mission statement, you could say. And that gets lost because the work that social workers and that people in these services do is so hard. And it's so exhausting that asking why might just be too overwhelming sometimes, and to answer it and to ask it. And so I think it's really important that we just really take the time to remember why we're there and why the clients are coming to our agency. So that's just my soapbox that I go on often, but it's so important because what we're doing are just literally people's lives. It's not, I always say, in my line of work sometimes, like, we're not saving lives, but people who work in this field, they're part of saving lives and saving families. And so it's just so important that we just are mindful of that and don't just skip over it when it's easy to do so.
And also too, one of the things that triggered for me and the thought was that we have to remember that our networking with each other becomes so important, because I need to know who are the good agencies and who are not. A story I tell, I'm sure Los Angeles County and City would not love me telling this story, but I tell it repeatedly. We had an agency that we repeatedly had to close because the executive director's policy was, well, if you came into her shelter, you had to go to her church. It was not funded by the church, not run by the church, and we had to repeatedly tell her, you cannot do this. You not only receive federal funds, you receive state and local funds. People do not have to go to your church. People have different faiths. This is not okay. And eventually we had to close. And it was one of those programs. I would never refer a client there. It just wasn't going to happen. And so that networking amongst all of us is, along with that collaboration, you begin to find out who are the good agencies, who really care about their clients and their programs, and who doesn't. So we also have to always be mindful of where we're referring our clients.
Thank you both. That was outstanding. I love the why question. Danara knows me well now that I ask a lot of questions, and I tend to annoy people. I've actually been given the tag name of the question girl throughout my life. So I'm glad to know I'm not alone, Dr. Peterson and Dr. George, Professor George. It's good to know. And I think it's a great takeaway for today that as advocates, we need to ask a lot of questions. And so we have one to give you. I have one from the audience. Jess is asking, so what is the first word of advice to give a woman and a child without funding or transportation in a rural community?
First off, it's not their fault. That the behavior that happened in the household is not theirs. It belongs to the abuser. That we believe them. That we're here to help and support in any way we can. And what do they consider their first priority? Besides safety planning, what is it that brought them in today, and what do they want us to help them with, and take their lead and go from there?
And I honestly feel there's nothing more that can be said. She absolutely, the best thing I love about your statement is we believe you, right? Again, it's that validation of we believe you, we are here, and now where do we go? Let's do it together. And to really have that empathetic, approach with the client, not the, oh, I'm here to save you. I'm here to make it better for you. It's not about us. It's about, I'm here with you. We are here. And I am now part of your plan that you're going to develop, and I'm going to help perfect it with you in terms of just taking a step forward. And as we know, there's no such thing as perfect. So perfection is just constantly redoing and retrying. And that's, to me, perfection. Perfection is trying and even taking that initial step. But I think telling the client you believe them is so huge, because I can only imagine so often, in their home, they're told they're not valued, that they're not believed. No one's going to believe you that this is happening. And if we are the first line to say, but we do, that speaks volumes of being able to actually go to the next step.
Thank you both. I couldn't have said that better myself either. And I really do feel those are the key words to tell any victim, I believe you, because a victim of any crime, I think, really does believe inside, they really don't think anyone's going to believe them, and that no one's going to stand behind them. And as social workers or anyone that works in the homeless shelters or the domestic violence shelters, is the first thing we can do is to offer that empathy and to give that approach that I am going to be here for you. You're not alone anymore. I think so many people, when they're victimized, feel completely alone and that no one understands their plight. So if we can give them that feeling of not being alone, that's something huge we can do for them. So thank you so much for joining us today. It is the end of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It was all of October, but let's remember that 365 days a year, we need to remember the victims of homelessness and domestic violence and domestic abuse, because I'm going with Dr. Peterson on that. There's so many that are psychologically abused, not just physically. So let's not wait for the black eye to show up. Let's be the advocates that look for it early, and let's keep the conversation going, not just in October. Let's not just wear purple in October. Let's think about it every day. And please, go forward, everyone here today, and spread the word. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to both our panelists, Dr. Peterson, Professor George. I can't thank you enough for joining us. To Thanara Bailey and the Siskiyou Beyond Good Ideas Foundation for hosting this and presenting today. And hopefully we can all come together again and have some progress to talk about in our areas. So everyone have a good day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.